Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. There are a few more people registered in that, but in deference to those of you who actually came on time, we will now start, okay? So for those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Eucharia Meehan. I'm the Registrar and CEO of the Institute. DIAS, I assume most of you are familiar with what DIAS is, but just maybe for those of you who aren't, I'll just have two sentences to say to you. So we're an independent research and advanced studies performing institute. We do research on fundamental research questions. We like to, I suppose, position this as being, we do research on the mathematical principles of nature and the universe through our work in theoretical physics. We study the universe and our solar system through our work in astrophysics. We then study our planet and the island through our work in geophysics. And finally, we study our identity as a Celtic people through our work in Celtic studies. So those are the areas of research that we are involved in. We have a long and lengthy legacy in discovery, and it comes no surprise that our byline, I suppose, is #DIASDiscovers. We were the first Institute for Advanced Studies established in Europe, obviously then the first in Ireland, and in fact still the only one still in Ireland. And in a nice link to this evening's talk, the first institute established was actually in Princeton, where Einstein, in fact, was based for quite a considerable period of time. We're a very globally connected institute and lead Ireland's participation in a number of global endeavours. I'll just mention two things that you might have heard of in the media. One being the development of the James Webb Space Telescope, the biggest space telescope ever to be developed. It's taking over from the Hubble big time. We are the only Irish group entity involved in that and co-designed one of the 4 cameras on board. Another area maybe where you might have heard about us is in the area of measuring seismic activity. When you hear on the news reports of small earthquake off Donegal or off Wicklow or whatever, and they report that data and information, that's actually coming from us. So there's two things you might have heard about us in the media. So I could talk, obviously, as in my role, quite a lot about DIAS and its research, and I'd encourage you to have a look at our website, attend more of our events, follow us on social to get a broader understanding just of the breadth and depth of all of what we do. In everything that we do, just moving now to talk a little bit about this evening's lecture, we have a strong commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion, and in fact are a very diverse institution in terms of the composition of our cohort. Many from international, the international arena across all the continents. And we're delighted actually that Dr. Pauline Gagnon agreed to visit with us and give not one, but two lectures. Some of you were lucky enough to have been here on Friday night when she did a lecture on What's Wrong with Me, which dealt with the issues of in terms of lack of equality, diversity, inclusion in physics generally, globally, and talked a little bit about her experience. And we were delighted that that lecture was presented to you in partnership with the Institute of Physics. This evening, she's going to look at that subject, I suppose, of equality in physics from a more historical perspective, and talk to us about the tragic destiny of Mileva Marić Einstein. But before I ask her to come and talk about that. I'm just going to say a few words about our speaker. So she was born in Chicoutimi in Quebec.
Not far from
Okay. In Quebec. She taught physics in local colleges before completing her PhD in particle physics at the University of California in Santa Cruz. She worked as a senior research scientist with Indiana University at CERN, where she participated in the discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012. She joined the CERN communication group, writing blogs and explaining particle physics in simple and accessible terms to media outlets worldwide. In 2014, she wrote a popular science book called Who Cares About Particle Physics? Making Sense of the Higgs Boson, the Large Hadron Collider, and CERN. She retired in 2014 and has since given more than 150 presentations to audiences worldwide talking about physics, diversity issues, and Mileva Marić Einstein. And she's currently writing a screenplay for a mini-series on Mileva Marić Einstein and other women in science. As I said earlier, we're absolutely delighted that she came to Dias, has given not one but 2 lectures, and I would invite her now to the podium to give her this evening's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. To turn on the microphone. Thank you, Carlia, for a very kind introduction. And indeed, I'm going to talk about the destiny of Mileva Marić Einstein. Many of you, or all of you, have all heard about Albert Einstein, but that's even more surprising that just about none of you have heard about her. And so the question tonight will be to understand, why has she been forgotten? The plan of my lecture tonight will be to examine first their 20-year-long collaboration based on existing documents and testimonies. I'll take into account the historical context and her personal circumstances. And that is really the key point in looking in that issue. And my goal is not to denigrate Albert Einstein, but you will see he will come out as a plain human being, a flawed one. My goal is to pay justice to Mileva Marić Einstein. So Mileva was born in what is today Serbia, in Titel, so very close to, not very close, but 100 kilometers maybe away from Belgrade. And she, in those days, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there the girls could not attend high school. In Serbia they were allowed, but not in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So her father obtained a special authorization for her to attend some classes that were reserved for the boys only. And, whoops. Sorry, So she completed her high school she went to complete her high school degree in Zurich in 1894. Mileva's temperament, her school friend would say that she was very brilliant, but very reserved. She would never raise her hand, even though she knew all the answers. She was not talkative, she was, but very persistent and determined. Was the kind of person who would get to the bottom of things, and she knew where she was going, and she was heading there. Albert Einstein was completely different. He was 3.5 years younger, born in Germany, very close to where I live now, in Ulm, in the southwest of Germany, Schwabish country. And he came from a Jewish family. And he was very inquisitive, opinion, and rebel, like many of you might have read. Not very disciplined. He could easily change his mind. He was insolent, sarcastic, and often mocking. Because he hated the discipline in the German schools, he came also to Switzerland to finish his high school. He applied to come to the ETH a year earlier, but was not admitted. But Mileva was admitted first in medicine, and then a year later she switched. So she was admitted on the first go, but he had to do 2 attempts. Albert, in 1896, the ETH was then called the Polytechnic School in Zurich. And they had a physics and mathematics section. It was a joint section. Albert was the youngest of the 5 students. There were only two in physics, Albert and Mileva. She was the oldest of the class, and there were three other students. Marcel Grossman is the one that we know more because Albert Einstein wrote some papers with him. Zurich University was the first German-speaking university to admit women in Europe. Even though they opened their doors to women in 1855, in 41 years, Mileva was just the fifth woman to be admitted there. But none had received a degree. They had never given a degree to any of those absolutely outstanding women, that's for sure, if they had managed there. So the studies lasted 5 years. Albert and Mileva shared a lot of passion for physics, for music, and very, very soon for each other. They were passionate for each other, as we learned by reading some of their letters that have survived. And two friends of Mileva, they were all living in the same boarding house for young women. So there was Ellen Koffler-Savage. She was from Vienna, and she was studying history. And she became a very close friend of Mileva. They exchanged letters throughout their lives. We'll see about that. And another one, Milana Botta, the one who is in the middle in the picture on the bottom. We'll also hear about her later. But both of them wrote letters to their family saying that Albert and Mileva were always together in the room, reading papers, reading books. They didn't like to attend the lectures. They preferred to study on their own. And Mileva wrote letters to her friend Helen throughout her life. And those letters were found by Milan Popovic, a professor of psychology at the University of Belgrade. And he published those letters, the letters that his grandmother received from Mileva. So we learn a little bit more about Mileva's life through those letters. Some are missing, so all the stories are there. But he was a psychologist, and he said that throughout this, he could see that Mileva became chronically depressed throughout her life. But the letters that are more significant are the ones exchanged between Albert and Mileva during the times when they were separated with the school holidays, Easter or summer vacation. 43 letters from Albert to Mileva have survived, but only 11 letters from Mileva. So we mostly have his viewpoint more than hers. These letters were published in 1992 by Venn and Schulman under the title The Love Letters. And those, it's a devastating thing because you read those letters and they're so madly in love at the beginning. And I've read it several times. And every time I hope that it will end differently. And throughout those letters, Radmila Milentievich, who has written the best and biography, the most documented biography on Mileva Marić, she notes that in Albert's letter, those letters are peppered with terms such as our new studies, our research, our viewpoint, our theory, our article, our work on relative motion. So we see that they were collaborating together, working together from the start. So the beginning of their collaboration, just to give you a bit of a sense of how they were working, they were always studying together. And when they were separated, Albert found that it was really unsettling. He said, when I read Helmholtz for the first time, it seemed inconceivable that you were not with me. And night is not much better. I find the collaboration very good, curative, and also less desiccating. And soon after that, another time, he writes, the climate here was visiting his parents who had moved from Germany to Milan. And he said, the climate here does not suit me at all. And while I miss work, I find myself filled with dark thoughts. In other words, I miss having you nearby to kindly keep me in check and prevent me from meandering. As I said, he was no happy-go-lucky type of guy, and she was very organized. So she kept him in check, and she would tell him what he should be reading and all that. So without her, he was a bit lost. So here are, they had written exam throughout the 5 years. Those are that's the average that they got for their exams. So you see they were of equal quality, there was 2 students, but then came the oral exam. And it was given by Herman Minkowski of the Minkowski's space. And Minkowski gave the grade of 11 out of 12 to the 4 men in the class, but Mileva ended up with a 5 out of 12. And because of that, the average number at the end, the overall grades, when they were adding everything together, the 3 men were above the passing grade of 5. Albert was just on the lead at 4.9, but they passed him anyway. But Mileva not. So they flunked Mileva. And remember that ETH had never granted a PhD to a woman before. And so in the math and physics section, the first one got it in 1902, so 2 years later, and it was in mathematics. The first one in physics came much later, but I forgot the date. I should write it there. So what is also commendable is that the 3 other students, the 3 math students, all got an academic position right away. And Albert kept sending letters all over Europe, and he said he started suspecting that Professor Weber was writing negative letters of recommendation, and not without reason, because Albert had numerous times insulted his professor. Instead of calling him Professor Weber, he would call him Mr. Weber, and it just didn't go very well with Professor Weber. And so then, because he didn't have a job, he refused to marry Mileva. And meanwhile, his father had failed. His father, Herman Einstein, had a business for electrification, but he went for direct current. And meanwhile, another Serb, Nikola Tesla, came up with alternative current. And so Albert's father lost his business because nobody wanted to have direct current. So they were given private lessons to make ends meet, and they continued to work and study as before. And Albert was really timid with his mother. Whatever she said, he would obey and all that. So, and she came from a very snotty, very rich family, and she said to him, she finds that Mileva is too old. She said, and Albert, very smart, wrote that in a letter. That's how we know that she said that. He said, by the time, she said, by the time you're 30, she'll already be an old hag. What are we? So she cannot enter a respectable family because they were a Jewish family and she was from a rich family. And Mileva was not Jewish nor German. On top of that, she had a congenital problem with her hip, and so she was limping. And she was too intellectual in Pauline Einstein's view. They were prejudiced against Slavic people, just like today, still. And Albert's father was also requesting that his son should find work before getting married. So not only she failed her exam, but on top of it, the family is putting a lot of pressure on Albert. And apparently Pauline was very mingling and all that was tough. But Albert confirms their collaboration. Once they were separated and during the summer holidays, he wrote to Mileva, I look forward to resume our new common work, which I think was on capillarity. You must now continue your research. How proud I will be to have a doctor for my spouse when I'll only be an ordinary man. So in October, he came back to Zurich, and they still had to write their thesis. They had, in fact, after the first level, it was not doctorate, but the master's level. And they still had to produce a thesis work on that. So they resumed their common studies. And the first article on capillarity, the first article that Albert Einstein published, was submitted to the journal in December 1900. And Albert refers to this article in a letter to Mileva, and he says, we'll try together to get some empirical data on this subject. So when we will be back together, we can work some more. Mileva wrote a letter to her friend Helen, and she says, we also sent a copy to Boltzmann, and we would like to know what he thinks of it. I hope he will write to us. So the two of them were doing that. And again, Albert wrote a little later, he said, my friends Michele Besso visited his uncle, Professor Young, on my behalf. And Professor Young is one of the most influential physicists in Italy. And he gave him a copy of our article. So both of them refer to this article as common work. But this article appeared signed only by Albert Einstein. Did Mileva wish to help promote Albert's career? And I would think so, because she was very organized. Her own happiness depended on him getting a job, and then they could marry. She was blocked because she had been blocked at the oral exam. She had a second chance the next year, but she had to wait for that. And also, she did not have a degree. She had no credibility to go and sign an article. It would have been like an imposter to sign an article when you don't have any credentials. And for her, it was way more important to get married with Albert than to get her name on the paper. And for Mileva, they were one entity. She made a pun one day. She had worked with some friends, Conrad Habich and his brother, in fact, and they had made a new multimeter, and then they needed a patent for that. Albert was the expert with patent, and then he wrote the patent, but then it was written under the name Habich Einstein patent. And Conrad Habich asked Mileva, why didn't you put your name there? And then she made a pun in German, so I'm going to show off my German. Warum? Wir beide sind nur Einstein. Ein, one, Stein, stone. So so that was the pun, Einstein, one stone. The two of us are just one unique entity. So if you sign it, it's good enough for me. We're together. We know we're together. So another biographer of Mileva, Dor Kirstich, thinks that since so few women publish articles in the Annalen der Physik, if she had signed it, it could have cast a shadow on his credibility. And that's not foolish, because even today it has been proven, I showed that on a Friday, that articles signed by women are cited less often than articles signed by men as a first article. In March 1901, Albert has to return to Milan because he has no money. His father has no money to help him, keep him in school. But he writes to Mileva how happy and proud I will be when the two of us together will have brought our work on relative motion to a victorious conclusion. So it's clear that they were working together. Nothing is clearer than that, and that's from the hand of Albert Einstein. We could stop it there, but I keep going a little bit. But so they're separated. Albert is in Milan, and then all of a sudden he got a tiny position replacement in a high school to teach for a few weeks. So he was not very far from Mileva. He said, let's go together for the weekend to Lake Como. But Mileva was just cramming to take her exam again in July, the second attempt at the exam. But finally she relinquished and she accepted to go, and she got pregnant. Without a job, Albert kept refusing to marry her. So a few months later, she has her second chance at the oral exam, and this time it's with Professor Weber. And he fails her again, and Mileva must go back to Serbia. She loses her student visa. She has to return. Meanwhile, Albert knows that he will get a job at the patent office, so he moved to Bern, and he was giving math lessons. And she came back twice to Bern to try to convince him to marry her, but she couldn't budge him. She gave birth to Lizer in January 1902, and we lose the trace of this child in 1903. So she gave birth in Serbia, in her family, and the father, Miloš, was very supportive of his daughter and all that, and he was someone who had savvy, and they said, when Miloš did something, it was well done. And so there was no trace of that child. It was hidden. There are different hypotheses. Either she was given for adoption or she died because there was an epidemic of some sort that killed many children at the time. So it's possible that either Helen Koffler, her friend, adopted her because her own child would have died of this epidemic of diphtheria or something like that. Or the second hypothesis is that Pauline Einstein took the child and sent it to be out of Serbia, out with barbarians, and sent it to Germany to be raised by a good Jewish family. And one man out of the blue called me and he said, oh, I'm the grandson of Lisa, she raised me and my sister and all that. And he had all sort of good proof of it. It was really interesting. And then out of the blue, 2 years later, a woman told me, oh, I'm a descendant of Mileva Marić. Then I put the two together. So now I'm waiting for results of DNA tests and maybe we will find out. Because before, and I also, so now I have the Mileva line, so that's the reference, and the two hypotheses. Helen Koffler having adopted, or another Jewish family in Germany. And then I also have the grandson of here. Everything is good. But the tests there was a long strike in the post in the Serbia this winter and so. But from that time on, Mileva went into chronic depression. After losing that child, it just destroyed her. Already 2 months before the child is born, Albert mentions a post at the patent office in Bern, thanks to the intervention of his friend Marcel Grossman's father, who knew the director of the office. And he wrote to Mileva, when you will be my little wife, we shall resume diligently our scientific work, such as not to become Philistines. But he starts work in June 1902. In another letter, he said, as soon as I get a job, I marry you. Nobody will stop me. He gets the job in June 1902, but it's only in January 1903 that they got married. So until then, there is no mention of marriage, and he never came to visit the child, to see his little girl, Lisa. So they got married on January 1903. And they started their married life, and that's the apartment where they lived in Bern. It's now it's an apartment, but it's called Einstein's house. It's a little museum. I went there, and that's where they were working at the table. Albert was working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week at the patent office, and he wrote to his friend, and Mileva also wrote how demanding his job was. Mileva assumes the domestic tasks, and in the evening, they would get together at the dining room table and work on their theories and their projects. A year later, their second child, Hans Albert, their first son, was born. And in 1905 came the miracle year where Albert published 5 incredible articles in the Annalen der Physik. The first one on photoelectric effect, which brought him the Nobel Prize in 1921. 2 papers on Brownian motion and the existence of molecules. And I didn't know that, but Brownian motion, you know, when you see a liquid that moves, when there's dust in water, whatever. Okay. Anyway, so, and that was the way that they proved that molecules existed. It was not known until then that molecules and atoms were really there. It was suspected, but by explaining the Brownian effect, which had been observed but not explained, using the fact that it was molecules, they also proved that molecules existed. Special relativity, the equivalence between mass and energy, E equals mc squared. And they also commented on 19 scientific papers in the Annalen der Physik, because when you sent comments in those days, you would be paid for it. And Albert was always trying to have a little bit more money, so he did that. And in his spare time, he submitted his doctoral thesis on the dimensions of molecules. It had to be an article that was not published anywhere else for his thesis. And he received his doctorate degree in July. Then he was exhausted, and but he confided to one of his biographers, Shankland, that his work on relativity had been with him for more than 7 years, so 1905 going back to 1998, and the photoelectric effect 5 years. So this is the time where the two of them were always working together up to 1902 that they were together. After working so hard to finish the paper on special relativity, Albert was dead beat. And apparently he spent 2 weeks in bed when Mileva read the article over and over before posting it. I bet you it was not just for the grammar. Then they finally had their first vacation in Novi Sad in Serbia. And it was a very nice city. It's still very nice. I went there last year. It was really nice. And it was one of the 3 visits that they did there. And they interacted with many people. And Dor Kistich, the biographer that I mentioned earlier, collected testimonies in Serbia for over 50 years. He went all over trying to find people who had met them during their visits and to get testimonies. We see him here with Hans Albert in 1971, so he was already in his late 60s. And Hans Albert told Kirchtig, he told me that the scientific collaboration continued into their marriage and that he remembered seeing his parents work together in the evening at the same table. He was 10 years old when his parents separated, so old enough to remember that. So Dor Kirchtig was a professor of computing science. He was trained as a physicist, but he taught computing science at the University of Ljubljana. And in his spare time, he would go back. He was originally from Novi Sad, and he would go back and try to find people who had met Albert and Mileva. And he got a lot of people telling them about what Miloš Marić, the younger brother from Mileva, had told them. Miloš had stayed with the Einstein family because he was a student in Romania. He was a student, a medical student, but he did 1 semester in Bern and 1 semester in Paris. And so when he was in Bern, he lived with Albert and Mileva, so he could see how they were working. And apparently Miloš told many people, he described how during the evenings and at night, when silence fell upon the town, the young married couple would sit together at the table, and at the light of a kerosene lantern, they would work together on physics problems. Miloš Jr. spoke of how they calculated, wrote, read, and debated. So Miloš was a man who was known for his integrity and someone who stuck to facts rather than giving his own opinions. And Dor Kirchtig got this testimony from 2 different people. Sidonia Gagnon, he met her in 1955. Sidonia Gagnon is the godmother of Mileva, and Sofia Galić-Golubović is one of her cousins, and both of them heard those stories from Miloš. And other testimonies, when they arrived in the Marić family in Serbia, Mileva told her father, before our departure, we finished an important scientific work which will make my husband known around the world. She really knew what she was talking about. So she said that in 1905, and Mileva's cousin, Sofia Galić-Golubović, was present because she was living with the family at the time. And so she heard it, she was a witness. 2 other people, the godmother, and Zarko Marić, cousin from Mileva's father, reported the same sentence to Dor Kirchtig. They had both heard it secondhand from Mileva's father. So this cousin, Zarko Marić, was the superintendent of the summer house that they had in the countryside. And that's where Albert and Mileva stayed because there was not enough room in the house in the city. And Zarko Marić told Dor Kirchtig how Mileva calculated, wrote, and debated with Albert, sitting in the shade under the apple trees on the left of the picture there. So, and that harmony and mutual respect was visible. So they were really always talking jargon and interacting together like that. Other testimony, Miloš Jr., the brother, always organized meetings with intellectuals in Novi Sad. And he invited Albert and Mileva to one of those meetings, and the mayor of Novi Sad was there. And apparently Albert Einstein boasted that he said, "I need my wife. She solves all my mathematical problems for me." And we see that also that Mileva was known for being extraordinarily good at mathematics. And at Easter 1908, Mileva decided to visit, to go back in Serbia to visit her family, but Albert stayed in town, and he hired a postdoc or a graduate student to help him. And he said, and this guy was living with Albert Einstein in his house. Albert was not excited about the guy, it's not much fun, but he's doing the calculations for which I would not have the time, and that's good because he's still working at the patent office in 1908. So when Mileva is not there, he needs someone to help him. And so then he says, "And come back, I really need you, a wife should be here, and the house is a mess, so please come back." And after the 3 years after publishing all those incredible papers, it took time for people to digest those papers. So in 1908, finally get the first offer, but it's an unpaid lecturer position at Bern University, which is done after his office job. It's unpaid, and he had 4 students and something like that. And then a year later, his thesis advisor, Professor Kleiner, opened a post for him at the University of Zurich. And a year later, their second son, Edward, was born. But then after that, between 1910 and 14, he changed positions. First took a position in Prague because he didn't like the salary in Zurich. So he went away for a year. And then they offered him a better salary when he came back. And then he went to Berlin, and we will find out in a minute. So up to 1909, we have some traces that Mileva was still helping him. There are 8 pages from Albert's first lectures in Zurich were written by Mileva. And so that's conserved at the Hebraic University in Jerusalem. And a year later, Max Planck had solicited Albert Einstein's opinion on one of his papers, and the draft of the reply is written again in Mileva's handwriting. We have not, the real letter that Planck received was never found, but it's a letter with all sort of scratch and stuff, so you see that it's a first draft. And so you don't ask your secretary to answer Max Planck, make sure that it's done properly. So Albert is becoming increasingly popular, has a lot of success. Every physicist in Europe now wants to work with him. As Mileva wrote to Helen, she said, he is now regarded as the best of the German-speaking physicists, and they gave him a lot of honors. I'm very happy for his success, because he fully deserves it. I only hope and wish that fame does not have a harmful effect on his humanity. And again, she was clear-seeing. A few months later, she writes, with that kind of fame, he does not have much time left for his wife, but what can you do? With fame, one gets the pearl, the other the shell. So that's also the time where it's documented that Albert Einstein's temperament changed. One of his colleagues in Prague wrote, given his great discoveries, Einstein felt invulnerable. His conversation could be a combination of harmless joke and hurtful comments. And another of his students wrote, his growing success, told the biographer, his growing success filled his soul with a feeling of superiority and sometimes arrogance, bordering hubris. Okay, so he's getting absolutely full of it. And Mileva is sinking further in depression and into a second place because he doesn't need her anymore to work with him. Everybody wants to work with him. Plus, she's depressed and not much fun to be around. And Albert is acclaimed, and he was also a womanizer, so he has all sorts of things that happen. And he starts a relationship in 1911 He goes back, in 1911, they were still exchanging affectionate postcards, but in 1912, he begins an affair with his cousin, Elsa Löwenthal, during a visit in Berlin. His mother had moved to Berlin, and she was really pushing him towards Elsa Löwenthal, who was a beautiful woman and also a socialite. She was always organizing parties and all that, and she loved society and stuff. And so for Pauline Einstein, that was much more person worth of her son. So she pushed him towards her. So it goes really badly between them. Albert then manages to get a job in Berlin because he wants to be close to Elsa. 2 years long, they exchange love letters during this time. And then he forced Mileva to move to Berlin, but she doesn't want to go there. There is the Pauline Einstein who is there and all that, and she probably suspects this relation. So their relationship is not working anymore, and Albert gives his condition to Mileva. Okay, if you want to stay together for the sake of the kids, okay, here are my conditions. You care that my clothes and linen are in good order and in good repair, that I receive regularly 3 daily rations in my room, that my bed and study room are properly tidy, and that the writing table is available only for me. Then he said, this is published, this paper, it exists. You renounce all personal relations with me, with the exception of necessities. You don't ask me to sit next to you at home and to walk or travel with you and with me. You're strictly obliged in your relations with me to take into account. You dare not reproach me, and I do not show any tenderness, but I also do not expect any from you at all. You must stop any conversation with me if I do demand so. You must at once leave my room or my working space upon request, and don't denigrate me in front of the children. Okay, so I propose you, and we're all scientists, propose an experiment. You try that with your spouse, and tell me how it goes. But there are some weird things in there. It's nasty, it's awful. But there are some weird things. The writing table is available only to me, because they were still working together all the time. He doesn't want her to be associated with him anymore. And then not sitting next to me, because that's what they were doing. They were always sitting one next to each other. So she has no choice, Mileva, she has to leave. And so on the eve of the First World War, she leaves Berlin and she goes back to Zurich with her 2 children. Hans Albert is 10 years old and Edward 4, I believe. So they have several, but then it was the beginning of 3 decades of misery for Mileva. Several times Edward was always sick. He had problems with respiratory problems, pneumonia, things like that, and he had to go to the sanatorium. It cost a lot of money. Mileva herself had a severe depression, according to the psychologist from Belgrade. And it was so severe that she could not walk anymore. She was kind of paralyzed and spent a year in bed in the hospital. And most of her life, she will struggle financially, except for a very short period in the 20s, because in their divorce agreement, her lawyer had managed to get that if Albert received the Nobel Prize, Mileva would get the prize money. He could get the fame, but she would at least have the money, maybe as a compensation for her work. So, but then she bought 3 small apartment buildings. We see her here on the balcony of the apartment that she had in one of them. But then it was the economic crash, 1929, and her tenants could not pay the rent and all that, and soon she lost 2 of her buildings, and she barely managed to save that one where she was living, but her son started to suffer from schizophrenia, and he had to be sent to the psychiatric hospital on and off, and it cost, again, lots of money. Albert kept saying, oh, the doctors are all saying that just because they want my money. Anyway, so we see here Mileva at the bottom, Mileva with her son Hans Albert and Edward in the middle, and the wife Frida from Hans Albert on the balcony. I went there, I was looking at the house because there is a plaque outside. I knew the address. So I was in Zurich to give this talk, and there is the plaque, and I'm looking at it, and a woman comes with her garbage, and she looks at me because I wasn't close. I said, I'm sorry, I was just reading it. Oh, no problem and all that. You know her? And I said, ooh. And then we chat a bit, and then she said, would you like to come? And she lived in her apartment. God, yes, we are going. So it was a nice, very nice apartment, and the view from the balcony was really nice, and I had seen those pictures. She had a cactus collection, we see it in the back there. Anyway, so for a few years she had it good there, but then it became difficult again. And this woman, she knew her, she also worked at the psychiatric hospital where the son was, and she said, and she became less and less well-dressed and in rags and stuff. And Mileva confided that she had always collaborated with Albert Einstein to various people. She mentioned it to her friend, Milena Bota, who repeated it to a journalist, and it was published. That's why we know that. And because the journalist was asking, your friend Mileva Marić, could she tell us how the relativity came about? And Milena said, you should ask Mileva, because she told me that she had always worked with Albert. She said that in a moment where she was really depressed and sad, but Mileva was not happy with that, talking publicly the outside about things like that. She also told one of her students, she gave math lessons to Maya Schuken, and a biographer of Albert Einstein quoted her saying that, yeah, she had confided that she had always worked with her husband. And to her godparents, she wrote a long letter where she had also explained that Albert had ruined her life. She mentioned it to her son, her mother, and sister, according to Dor Kishtish, the one who went to collect testimonies. One time, she seems to have tried to claim her share. In 1925, Albert was rewriting his will, and he said to Mileva, you should tell the kids that the Nobel Prize money, they should consider that to be their inheritance. And Mileva opposed to that, saying, no, this money is mine. That's part of the divorce agreement. That's something else. You have to give something to your sons. And she must have, we don't have this letter, but she must have said something like, you better not do that, or I will talk publicly about what happened. She must have said something like that. We don't know. But Albert replied, and that letter was read by Valmila Milentievich. It's in Jerusalem. And Albert wrote, but you really gave me a good laugh when you started threatening me with your memories. Nobody else quoted that letter. She's the only one who went to the archives because they opened 50 years after the death of Albert Einstein in 2005. Doesn't it ever dawn upon you for even a single second that no one would pay the least attention at all to your rubbish if the man with whom you're dealing had not perchance accomplished something important? When a person is a non-entity, there's nothing more to be said, but one should then be modest and shut up. I advise you to do so. And after that, Mileva never tried to speak again. He also added at the bottom of the letter, not only children need a bit of thrashing, but also grown-ups, especially women. And there are records of Albert hitting Mileva. But the Einstein myth was born, and that myth was initiated by Helen Dukas, who was Albert's secretary starting in Berlin, and she emigrated to the US with him and worked with him in Princeton. And a close friend of Albert Einstein, Otto Nathan, also a Jewish German person, an economist, and both of them, Helen Dukas and Nathan, became the executor of Albert's estate after his death, and they obtained the intellectual property of everything that Albert had done. Both tried to hide the existence of Mileva. A researcher, Payson, a physicist, who was working on the history of science, Canadian guy, I met him, and he told me that he was a young researcher and he was trying to write papers about Albert Einstein at his beginning. And was he really forced to leave, abandon that daughter or not? Was it really that he would have lost his job at the patent office for having an illegitimate child and all that? And he had so struggled to get that job. So he was trying to understand how that, and he was trying to have access to the documents held by Helen Dukas. Now they're all public. But then she would give him little bits, but then they would always review what he had written. And if they were not, they would always say, no, you cannot say that. You must write it like that. And he said, I did as they told me, because otherwise they would have blocked my only source of information. So they were really controlling of everything. After Mileva's death, the wife of Hans Albert found a box containing, with a little paper on top saying Einstein. It contained all the letters that they had exchanged. Those 43 letters, plus 11 from Mileva, were in that box. And so she found them. And Otto Nathan visited the apartment after her death, but he probably destroyed any type of a proof, because we don't have any written document showing that she was still working as a scientist. But those letters were found. Hans Albert wanted to publish those letters that he had from his parents, and he was prevented in court by Otto Nathan and Helen Dukas for doing it. They blocked it until their death, which happened in 1982 and 87, and that's why it's only in 1992 that the love letters appeared. And then there was a big fuss of people were talking about, oh, what happened with Einstein. But the myth was born, and people even today look at the guy and they say, ah, look at him. You can see that he's a genius. Look at the hair and all that. Come on. If someone was a genius in the family, it's his sister, Maya. It's a genetic problem in the family. It has nothing to do with genius. And if there is a genius, it's her. Much nicer. So it was fame for Albert and complete oblivion for Mileva. She died in August 1948. In the winter, she had slipped on the ice in Zurich while visiting her son, Edward, at the psychiatric hospital. She broke her hips and she never recovered. And there is a plaque, the one that you see on the left, in the Zurich cemetery. And there is also a bust in Novi Sad at the university campus to Mileva. And the one on this one was put by the Serbian people with pride and love, the people of Serbia. And the conclusion to that, the proof of their collaboration. We don't have proof, papers signed, published together. We don't have that. And I think we will never have it. The clearest evidence that we have comes from Albert's own hand when he writes Our Work on Relative Motion. Looking at how they interacted and worked together, by today's standard, they would be scientific collaborators. There are a few handwritten documents that I showed, the two things, the lecture notes and the letter to Planck, that show that she was still active up to 1909, 1910, and numerous testimonies from friends and family all around. Indirect proofs, for example, that he gave the Nobel Prize money to Mileva when he was someone who really liked money. He was not parting with his money easily. And also, many of you are theorists, and you might, I would be happy to hear your opinion on that. The decline in Albert Einstein's productivity and creativity after the separation. So after 1914, he was at the forefront of modern physics with the photoelectric effect, with the special relativity and general relativity. And then came quantum mechanics, and it nearly drove Niels Bohr insane with arguments and counter-arguments against quantum mechanics. So he became behind everybody. My opinion is that their union was based on love and respect. It's together that they produce uncommon work. Their individual contributions will never be separated. We will never find out who did what, but it's always like that in a collaboration. You all know that, no? You exchange ideas with your collaborators, and it evolves, and then you think of something else, and at the end, you cannot tell exactly where it started. Mileva was the first person to recognize Albert's talent. Without her emotional and intellectual support, he would never have succeeded. He was a failed academic, and she helped him make something. She merged her own aspiration with his, and that's the way she had been raised in a very patriarchal society, just like her mother was behind her father and all that. And she saw his success as their shared success when she said they were Einstein. Whoops. And the more it went on, the more he had to lose. Once it took so much time, 1909, 4 years after all those papers, the miraculous year, before he got a position and got to be known. How do you want him to turn around and, oh, by the way, have I told you that everything I did was with my wife? It's too late. Even if they started that jointly, they both agreed to do that because she knew that he needed to make a name for himself. Even if she had agreed, it was not possible to change it. Also, she was a reserved person. She was not after honor and fame. She spoke little about herself, and she always loved him. And she had no degree, damn it. She had no legitimacy. So everything went haywire when ETH refused to give her a degree. So we cannot change history, but we can acknowledge the errors of the past and pay justice. And that's why Italian physicist, Gabriella Grayson, took the initiative to ask ETH to grant Mileva her degree. And I added a layer on that, and I said yes, and the other 4 women who were also flunked before her, because all those women were most likely very discerning. So please take a picture of the address. Gunther Di Sittori is the rector, the dean of science at ETH. I spoke with him. At first he was saying, oh yes, we'll look at it and all that. And he said, yeah, we cannot just make a public relation coup by saying that we do that for equality and inclusion and all that. We have to do the research. But now he doesn't even answer my emails, even politely. So please, let's put a little bit of pressure. And before ending, I just want to make a parallel with Maria Sklodowska-Curie, because they were contemporary. Marie was born in 1867, Mileva in 75. But they met in 1895 and they got married. And right away, Pierre got his PhD, and right away he got a position at La Sorbonne, a professor position. So that was really nice, easy. He was not struggling like Albert was. So then in the 4 following years, they published 32 papers jointly or separately. It was not a problem for him to sign a paper with his wife. He had nothing to lose. But in 1903, Pierre Curie heard that the Nobel Committee was going to give him a Nobel Prize, but not to Marie. And he said, oh, he said, if you don't name Marie as well, I won't accept the prize. Then they put Marie in. So Albert and Pierre had different temperaments to start with. But also the main point is that he was already established. It was easy for them. They didn't face the same adversity. So the best biography of Mileva Marić is from Radmila Milenciewicz. Unfortunately, this was printed by some obscure company that does not exist anymore. So I was talking with Radmila Milenciewicz, trying to encourage her to get a better editor for her book. And she had in November 22, I contacted her again and asked her, where are you at? And I learned that she was terminally ill. And she asked me to take care of her book and try to get it published. So I'm trying to do that, but it's very difficult. Publishers, you see, something that could tarnish the image of Albert Einstein, and it's difficult. So for example, I myself published a book, a popular science book, at Oxford University. So I contacted my editor and I asked, would you be interested? The guy said, oh yeah. And then we sent the book to be reviewed by 10 people. 9 reviewers wrote raving reviews, and one guy, I think I know who it is, someone wrote a book called The Real Story of Mileva Marić Einstein. The Real Story of Mileva Marić. And it's 30 pages, the biography, and then it's published by MIT Press, and then there is 100 pages of going on and on and on, gnawing at a bone like a dog, going on. Again, arguments that have been made by people at the very beginning who were trying to promote Mileva, but didn't have much information. And so then there were all sorts of things that were wrong in what this guy said, but nevertheless, my editor said, oh, no, would never, not even let me reply to that. So if you know any editor, if you have a friend in the edition, I was talking with Brendan here, IOP would be a very nice avenue, so we should try it. So my conclusion is that we should stop talking about the lone genius. This image that we are given in physics is wrong. We are always presented with this lone sciences, and it's completely false. And that's not the way science is done. Science is done in cooperation. And so it really deters a lot of young people to go into science because they think that they have to measure up with Einstein, this myth that has been constructed. So we should stop talking about the lone genius. That's why I'm working on this mini-series on Mileva Marić and other women scientists with a friend. So we're working on that. And we should really be talking about a couple of genius. That would be closer to the truth. Okay, thank you for, sorry for. Yes, Vince.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for this painfully enlightening talk. I don't have a question, it's more of a comment. Growing up, I wanted to be a physicist, and Albert Einstein was my idol. Because having read history of science, you could see, we've had this discussion before, you could see that an idea was ready to be born. That this is where science was going, and you would think, well, maybe if Planck wasn't around, somebody else would have come up with that idea. But what made him my idol was that his ideas just suddenly came out of nowhere. And if he hadn't come up with them, who would have? They were just so incredibly imaginative. And the first time I heard you give this talk, I realized why that was the case. That a lot of it was coming from a very unusual scientist, his wife. Yeah. So that actually made me feel a lot better. I felt like, oh well. Yeah, I mean, there is proof for diversity in physics. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Yeah. I come from those parts, and I grew up listening to stories about Mileva because I grew up in Croatia, which used to be the same country. So I heard gossips. Back then, those were gossips, and we discussed. And then letters, little by little, those letters came up, and I think even recently, some of the letters were auctioned and now are actually available to the public. So I think more and more and more of the truth will come out. I don't think that all of the letters and all the proof that is there is out. And when I read the Lone Genius, I understand that he was a genius, sort of, but I think he was also a lone genius because he never gave her from what I heard and what I read about, that apparently he never gave her that money, and that she was fighting for her children for that money from the Nobel Prize, because what he gave her was loans to buy houses And eventually he ended up owning those houses. So he not only ruined her emotionally, ruined her career, he ruined her financially. And to me, this is like to me, it's a devastating story. And I'm so thankful that finally someone is giving her some recognition, even though she's dead, she will never hear it. I think we all need to hear this. And thank you so much.
Well, the one we should thank is Radmila Milentievich, because she went through all the archives and pulled out all the letters and looked at everything. She did an incredible job, and she was already in her 80s when she did that. And so, yeah, I looked for I read in a feminist magazine in the 80s something about Mileva Marić Einstein. And I was really puzzled, and there was no internet then. Now you see why I have gray hair. There was no internet, and I was really curious about all that, but I was asking various people, I never got any information. And then I was at CERN one night. I was a team leader in the control room for taking data with the accelerator, and I was always going around the room to meet everybody, to make sure that I would know everybody if there was some disaster, and we had one disaster a day. And I met this woman from Serbia. She introduced herself, and she was from Serbia, and I said, "Oh, do you happen to know Mileva Marić Einstein?" She said, "Of course. She's a national hero in Serbia." And I thought, my God, what is that? For 25 years, I've been looking for information, and I found nothing. So then we decided together we would try to find more. We went to the CERN library. We started pulling out sort of books. Meanwhile, that book came out from Radmila, and I met her in New York. And so, but the story was not for the money. He gave her the money for the Nobel Prize. She was entitled to the interest, but the capital was under the control of Albert. And so, then she lost 2 of her buildings, and the third one was slowly going down as well. She was in debt because of the cost of the care for Edward and all that. And at one point, she had so many debts, she asked Albert, "Could you please help us? Because we will both, Edward and me, be soon on the streets." So Albert bought back the building, and then to be sold later and all that. And when she sold it, she didn't give him back the money. She took the money and she put it under the name of Edward, to make sure that Edward would be taken care of, because Albert was doing nothing for him. And he had really abandoned him when he left for the US. So that's why this story with the money, and that's why Otto Nathan went to the apartment to try to look everywhere if the money was not hidden somewhere, but she had already given it to the director of the psychiatric hospital, who was the responsible caretaker of legal caretaker. So that's the story about the money, because there are all sorts of things. Of course, already the lecture is quite long, so I have to.
I have a question about what you know about how a myth like that is actually kept alive, because how a myth of the lone genius is kept alive, because he was among very intelligent people all of his life. Yeah, there was Planck, there was Brown. How did it not occur to them, if nothing else, that not anyone was coming out?
But in physics, it's not the most sexy field, that people know what we do and all that. And so we have this icon. And so it's very important to the field. And it's, I think we have to lose something by losing this. Everybody knows Albert Einstein. Nobody knows what you were working on or what I was working on, but everybody knows Albert Einstein. And so it is very important. And when this horrible book, The Real Story of Mileva Marić Einstein was written, they did a press release, and they sent that to all the major newspapers everywhere. In North America, in Europe, it was published everywhere. Not one journalist read the book. They all published the press release as it was. I read the book, and it says, all the proof that we have are testimonies from Soviet people. We all know we cannot trust them. They're just out there to promote national pride. Yeah. And so a journalist from Austria National Radio called me because it was the 75th anniversary last year, August, of the death of Mileva. And she was asking me a question, and she had all the arguments that you find in this book. Then I asked her, did you read the book? She said, no, I haven't. But she was just going, and I said, you have to read it. Then you will realize that this is a piece of trash. And it was published by MIT Press. And when I tried with Berkeley, I tried with Johns Hopkins, I tried with 5 or 6 different places, Duke University. Now we tried with IOP, I will try with Cambridge, I will try with different editors. But you're going against a wall. It's really interesting.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I know this is a minor point, but do you have any idea about why they rejected her degree the 2 times? Is there any discussion of that as to why, kind of from the beginning, she was put down?
From what I understood, the oral exam was with 1 examiner. And I had an oral exam for my master's degree, and there were 3 examiners. And then it's a bit easier because there are 3 people. And she was writing whatever on the board, and then you erase everything, and there's no proof. And in 41 years, they had not graduated 1 woman. So there are some signs there that there was a pattern. That's all.
Maybe a risky thing to say, but you did have it there on your slide about Einstein's later work. And I think it maybe should be mentioned that general relativity was 1915, which I think is after this period. A couple of years later, he predicted the existence of gravitational waves. He invented cosmology, there was work on the problem of motion, and various other things. So that's why we all know about Einstein. Have you considered, or has anybody written to the Nobel Prize Committee? Because that was for the photoelectric effect, right, from 1905. In the same way they mentioned writing to ETH for an honorary degree, or not an honorary, but a retrospective. I know the Nobel Prize Committee doesn't have a great reputation in terms of recognizing the proper origins of work.
But there is no proof. I have no proof here. We just have the historical context. We have their own personal circumstances and all that, but there is no proof. You can see it through the letters that they were working together, but you don't have a document saying, look, those are our calculations. It's clear. That's where it comes from. We don't have that. We don't have that. And that no longer exists. I didn't think of looking under the carpet when I went to visit her apartment, but I think all that is long gone. I think the only information I might uncover is with the DNA test, maybe. But this is a minor thing.
I didn't say thanks very much for really enjoying.
But on general relativity, it's true. It was published, the first one in 1914 with Marcel Grossman, the second 1915 alone. And but we don't know if, again, they had not discussed several things ahead of time in the few years before. That we don't know. We just don't know. But as a friend of mine, a theorist, was saying, special relativity is beautiful, but general relativity is just mind-boggling. And I haven't read those theories myself, being an experimentalist, but I'm sure that, with gravitational waves and all that is amazing. But again, you see, he first worked with Marcel Grossman because he was stuck with the Riemann's tensor and all that. He could not make it. And so he needed more help. And then he was not willing so much to work with Mileva.
He also changed his mind a few times about the existence of gravitational waves.
Okay.
over the course of about 30 years.
And
a
the
couple of famous
cosmological
sentences.
constant that he added. But so I think many people, especially you here, theorists, can appreciate, is the decline in his creativity in those after general relativity. But that was the top of what he, and after that, not much. Yes.
Very nice lecture. Just a comment. Can we take a lesson maybe from your lecture that basically, or naively say, genius are not necessarily good people in the sense the morality and intelligence are two different things. So I mean, even Newton, that personally for me is even greater than Einstein, was an awful person, but was a genius. And so can we say that in general, in the history of science, we should not forget that, again, morality and intelligence are
Yeah, if you want to talk about morality, we could talk about Schrödinger.
Yeah.
But we won't. And we could talk also about Michael Jackson, who was an incredible musician and all that, but also a pedophile. So yes, there are countless people like that who did great things, but at the same time, as a human being, very questionable. But the history is stuffed with those things. One guy at the BBC 4 did a program on called Evil Genius, and he tries to he asked people to judge if that person is really evil or a genius. And he asked me to come and talk about Albert Einstein, but anyway, he didn't do very well on the I saw the show was aired, and at the end, people still voted that he was a genius. But it was funny because. It was funny because they were still under the aura of glory and all that. It was clear. It's very interesting.
Can I ask one more? Just
Wait for the microphone because there is
I can be
No.
it's
It's for the recording.
I'm sorry.
It's for the recording.
Just to bring it back to Mileva again. Are there any records of her grades and exams that she took? Like, is it meticulously or somehow lost? Because again, I'm sorry, I haven't prepared a little bit better. I should know better because I listened to about her so much. As far as so what I heard, and maybe it was a little bit sensational when in discussions that I've been into. She was always an excellent student. She had better grades than Einstein. But then when it came to her doctorate or just finishing her degree, she failed. They failed her. Was that?
So there is just one point where the grades really differ. It's about practicum. So experimental physics. Albert had done something with an electrical device once and he got a shock, and after that he was nervous. And so he didn't like that and was not very talented, but Mileva was good. And so when he signed this patent for the multimeter, it's very surprising because he had no talent for that, but she was very good. And so, but that's the only place where Albert was not necessarily less good than Mileva. But those are the grades. In that book, The Real Story About Mileva Marić, they say, we see from her grades that she was a terrible student. And I did the average minimum 6 times to make sure I wouldn't get messed up. And it's exactly the same, 4.75, 4.76. So
I'm sorry, is that a passing, like that's a passing grade or?
No, because then they were waiting the written exam, the oral exam, and a thesis, a dissertation of some sort. So there were 3 items with different weights, and in the final grade you had to be above 5, and she got 4, whatever it was, under.
Are there any other questions or observations? Because I think we're going to bring things to a close. That was an absolutely fascinating, if not somewhat shocking talk, because I wasn't really familiar with her story, so I'm still reeling a little bit from that. On behalf of myself and you all, I would like to thank Pauline very much for the lecture and also for spending the time with us answering questions and taking the comments. We wish you success in getting the book published, and we can talk about that again. But just to close, if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together in the traditional way, just to thank Pauline very much.